Hello, today is Monday, November 3rd, 2025, and I'm going to read again today from Richard Rohr's Daily Meditation. And Richard is a Catholic Franciscan priest who I often read his writings or writings from his group. And I'm going to read one of his meditations today. And it is, decidedly Christian text, and yet it focuses on action in the world rather than individual salvation for the afterlife. And I think if you do take the time to read the Bible closely, I think that's really what the intent was for the writers, for Jesus telling the stories. Um, I may have a bias, but I really feel like the texts have been co-opted over the years by an empire as Christianity has cozied up to power and control and changed the emphasis on the next life and focusing on quote-unquote sin, preventing your soul from being saved, when in fact, if you read carefully, much of what Jesus talked about was what we do in this world and how we treat one another. So, at least as told by the stories in the Bible. So I'm going to be reading this Christian text, Christian meditation, and perhaps even encouraging you to take a look at some of the stories in the Bible, not from the intent at all of saying you should become Christian, but just understanding how sacred texts can teach things about living in the world, just as every writing can really be done that way. If you read carefully and discriminately. Anyway, the meditation I'll be reading today is a teaching to be lived out. And it starts off with the assemblers of this meditation saying, Father Richard considers how challenging it is to live out Jesus' teaching on the Sermon on the Mount. And he talks about Sermon on the Mount in this, as I'll be talking about, but that's what it's called, or generally referenced as, in the Gospel of Matthew. And the same story is considered the Sermon on the Plain in the Gospel of Luke. And there's slightly different emphases, and I can get into all different reasons why that exists, but I encourage you to try to read both of them. And I'll mention those particular chapters and verses as we go through this. Anyway, so Richard Rohr writes, I am told that the Sermon on the Mount, the essence of Jesus' teaching, is the least quoted scripture in official Catholic Church documents. We must be honest and admit that most of Christianity has focused very little on what Jesus himself taught and spent most of his time doing: healing people, doing acts of justice and inclusion, embodying compassionate and nonviolent ways of living. Rohr goes on, I'm grateful that my spiritual father, St. Francis of Assisi, took the Sermon on the Mount seriously and spent his life trying to imitate Jesus. Likewise, Francis's followers, especially in the beginning, tried to imitate Francis. At its best, Franciscanism offers a simple return to the gospel as an alternative lifestyle more than an orthodox belief system. That example continues to be lived out by the Quakers, Amish, Mennonites, the Catholic worker movement, and others. And just a side comment, he's not saying that any of those movements are perfect, or even that Franciscanism is perfect, but the essence was there, or is there. Anyway, Rohr goes on, for these groups, the Sermon on the Mount is not just words. At their best, they include the outsider, prefer the margins to the center, are committed to nonviolence, and choose social poverty and divine union over any private perfection or sense of moral superiority. At the end of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus gives us this short but effective image so we will know that we are to act on his words and live the teachings instead of only believing things about God. And there's a quote from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 7, verses 24 through 27. Everyone who listens to these words of mine and acts on them will be like a wise person who built a house on rock. The rain fell, the floods came, and the winds blew and buffeted the house. but it did not collapse. It had been set solidly on rock. And everyone who listens to these words of mine but does not act on them will be like a fool who built a house on sand. The rain fell, the floods came, and the winds blew and buffeted the house, and it collapsed and was completely ruined. War goes on. Dorothy Day, one of the founders of the Catholic worker movement, understood the Sermon on the Mount as the foundational plan for following Jesus. Day writes, "Our manifesto is the Sermon on the Mount, which means that we will try to be peacemakers." And Ward comments, "She observed that we are trying to lead a good life. We are trying to talk about and write about the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes, the social principles of the church, and it is most astounding the things that happen when you start trying to live this way. To perform the works of mercy becomes a dangerous practice." Those are all words from Day. Jesus, and then Ward goes on, Jesus taught an alternative wisdom that shakes the social order instead of upholding the conventional wisdom that maintains it. I'll read that again. Jesus taught an alternative wisdom that shakes the social order instead of upholding the conventional wisdom that maintains it. Jesus' Sermon on the Mount is not about preserving the status quo. It's about living here on earth as if the reign of God has already begun. And Rohr notes, see Luke chapter 17, verse 21. Now in this reign, Rohr says, the sermon tells us, the poor are blessed, the hungry are filled, the grieving are filled with joy, and enemies are loved. Of course, lots goes through my mind, and I'm wholeheartedly in agreement with Rohr's understanding and how Christianity, he speaks of Catholicism, but Christianity in general has gone off track, emphasizing adherence to rules and laws, the very thing that the Bible tells us that Jesus chastised the Jewish leadership in his time for doing, co-opting their beliefs to allow themselves a comfortable life in the midst of empire instead of fighting against it. But anyway, that's kind of what I was hearing out of all this and feeling out of all this. But if you want to read some of that scripture yourselves, I highly suggest you go to the Gospel of Luke chapter 6, and specifically the Sermon on the Plain, as it's called in Luke, is 17 through 26, verses 17 through 26. But I really encourage you to read to the end of that chapter, since that is the whole sermon, not just the Beatitudes part of it. And then, of course, in the Gospel of Matthew, it's the sermon is really chapters 5 through 7, but the Beatitudes part is verses 1 through 11. But again, I encourage you to read the whole Sermon on the Mount. And as I reread those again this morning, I just shake my head at what's going on in the United States and what so-called Christians in the U.S. are doing versus what Jesus, in these stories anyway, is saying that we should do. And it just filled me with anger and with grief. As I would imagine if Jesus were alive today and these stories of what he said and taught are close to the truth, that he would be upset, angry, and grief-stricken at what's going on in the world. So anyway, I encourage you to take a look at those chapters and see what you think. And read multiple versions of it, because there's lots of different English interpretations that give different nuances on it. The Common English version is one. The New Standard Revised Updated Edition is another one. The New International Version is another one. The scholars that wrote those interpretations had different emphases, which is one of the difficulties of the Bible, because there is not one single way to interpret from one language to another, or to translate from one language to another. It's interpretation, and scholars don't always agree. So I just encourage you, if you are going to read sacred texts, read it in different versions. And it is one of the reasons why Muslims are encouraged to only read the Quran in Arabic, because that was supposedly the original language it was written in, and translations and become interpretations into other languages. Um, but it all becomes very difficult because, especially with the scriptures in the Bible, because there's no single one manuscript that is original. There's bits and scraps from various times that scholars have tried to weave together to really understand what perhaps was in the original text, which we no longer have. Anyway, I'm going way off track and making too long of a video, but I encourage you to consider the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain in Matthew and in Luke, and see what it says to you about living life today.